So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Cashwell, Chief Academic Officer for Teacher.
Obviously, the theme of the conference has been around transformational learning, and hopefully over the past day and this morning, you have been reflecting on how you as a leader, as a teacher leader, no matter what your role is centrally or in a school, how you can empower transformation in your buildings. And I think the sessions yesterday were outstanding examples of how to make that happen. So it's been a really great conference to date, and hopefully that's really increased your capacity and your ability to reflect. And so today's session, this essential session, is going to kind of tie up some of those concepts around transformational learning, but specifically we're going to focus on the student for a little bit. And so while the student isn't the only important factor when we think about transformational learning, it's sort of that central focal point and definitely the lever for change. So we're going to focus on that for a bit. And we're also going to talk a little more deeply about student agency, that concept, and how that's really an underpinning concept when we think about transformational learning. So our division's core values, they're not only on the screen, but here on the poster. You see them on our website. They're at the bottom of most of our email signatures. I want to focus on that one about respect for just a second. So when we think about respect and we look at that core value deeply, it's about really honoring diversity of thought and individual contributions. I want to let that sink in for a moment, right? Honoring individuals, diversity of thought, individual contributions are prized. Okay, and one of those questions that we would ask ourselves around that value is, what am I doing to invite, recognize, and esteem the perspectives of those around me? What am I doing? Can you think of examples of how you're putting that into practice every day in your school? How are we modeling that, not only for our students, but for the entire Virginia Beach City Public Schools, for our community? How are we modeling that? I think we've got music on the podium there. That was supposed to be on earlier. So you don't have to look far in our media and in our culture to see examples of how individuals, I'm going to turn this off, of how individuality, you never know what's going to happen up here. We don't have the music when we want the music. We have music when we don't want the music. Anyway, so you don't have to look far for these images, right? Where we celebrate uniqueness everywhere. This idea of standing out among the crowd, being unique, being different, they're everywhere. Our culture is celebrating this concept of uniqueness, right? Be yourself. Everybody else is taken. But have you noticed this paradox? Right, in our culture? So we're a culture that's constantly talking about how it's the cool thing to stand out and be unique, yet we're a culture that constantly compares individuals to the group. We compare individuals to others. Our entire educational system is centered around this concept of average, of rank. Everything from oftentimes the way we group students by age, the way our school years are set up, the way our classrooms are constructed, often the way our curriculum is designed, the way we rank and order and file students is oftentimes centered around this concept of average. So I think it's really interesting when you stop and consider that paradox. So, you know, here our culture is really celebrating this concept of individuality. You see it within our core values, yet think about the way we operate in society and particularly in schools. So how about this gentleman at 94 years old, set to graduate? Not your average college student. How about this fascinating and outstanding lady? Do you recognize Katherine Johnson? Not your typical mathematician, physicist, certainly not today, maybe not the average, but particularly if you stacked her up against her peers in 1960. Ashley Graham, not your average supermodel, hey, when you stack her up against the supermodel crowd or norm. How about Muggsy Bogues? 5'3". If you lined him up with other NBA stars, you might find he's not your average NBA star, is he? How about this gal? First F-14 Tomcat pilot in the U.S. Navy. Certainly was not the average pilot you'd find in the U.S. Navy at the time, not their typical candidate. And then there's this gentleman. Take a look at his role at Harvard. And what if I also told you that he was a high school dropout? Probably say he's not the average college professor, huh? But it's just this gentleman, Todd Rose, who authored the book, The End of Average, who would argue that we ought not be comparing him or anyone else to the average or in relation to the average. We continue to compare individuals to the group in society and in schools. But he argues in his book that when we do this in education, it's not just flawed, it's damaging. It's damaging to students, and we lose talent every single day. So why this need to cling to the average, to cling to this idea of the norm? Right? It permeates everything we do. It permeates our way of thinking. Perhaps it's the roots in math that make the average something so easy to cling on to, right? It seems like if there's a root in mathematics, there's some simplicity in a complex situation. Maybe it's just an easy way to think about ourselves and others in relation to mass society. It's a way that we can group. But this kind of grouping, this kind of comparison really has contributed to these stereotypes and comparisons that can really be unhealthy for our students. So in his book, Ted Rose really debunks this myth of average. So even though it's absolutely a mindset that's ingrained in so much that we do, and really particularly in education, as I said earlier, he uses this powerful example from the United States Air Force to really illustrate the fact that average isn't the way we often think about it. So take a moment and hear his explanation.
It's 1952, and the Air Force has a problem. They've got good pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results, and they don't know why. And for a while, they blamed the pilots. They even blamed the technology. They eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases can travel faster than the speed of sound, and where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average size person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged side profile, right? Means you're not, no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. Doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged side profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem. And their response was bold. They banned the average. Meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size. Meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted that the cockpit could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. Now, the companies that made these planes, as you can imagine, weren't happy. Right? They argued and lobbied, and they said it's going to be impossible, or at least impossibly expensive, to build a flexible cockpit. But once they realized that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, suddenly it was possible. And it turned out it wasn't that expensive. And in fact, they made great strides, leveraging simple solutions that we all take for granted in our everyday life, like adjustable seats. And as a result, the Air Force not only improved the performance of the pilots that they already had, but they dramatically expanded their talent pool. And today, we have the most diverse pool of fighter pilots ever. But here's the thing. Many of our top pilots would have never fit in a cockpit designed on average. So, most of us have never sat in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet, right? But we've all sat in the classroom. And I would argue that these are the cockpits of our economy. And I think we all know that we have some problems.
Pretty powerful when you think about this notion of average as he's debunked it, and particularly when you think about classroom seats as the cockpits of our economy. I hope that resonates with you. And he gives that example about how so many of our top fighter pilots today would never even have had a place in our Air Force and our Navy if we had continued to have the Navy and Air Force designing seats to the average. So what does that mean for your classrooms? We're losing students every day who just can't overcome the drag of an educational system that's designed on average. In his book, he goes on to talk about how average doesn't make sense and average is a myth, not just when we think about size and shape, but so many other things. Your character traits, for example, this stereotyping that happens, that students who are kinesthetic learners can only learn that way, right? We're all unique. There's no right way. There's no one way. Everyone has this unique ability to learn, and that context and behavior can change. That behavior can change depending on the context. Things aren't fixed. And this idea that there is no perfect way to the work you aspire to. There's no one trajectory to get to be a Harvard professor, right? Okay? Could start as a high school dropout, could start as a high school valedictorian. There's no telling. Everyone's trajectory may be different, and there's no right one. We saw a great example yesterday in George Couros' presentation. Remember that straight line and then that one that looked like a lot of squiggles in the middle? So that squiggly line, there's that pathway. The pathways our students will embark upon will be unique to them. And we should be opening those opportunities for them, not wedging them into a straight and narrow path. So if we really think about this and this idea that we're losing students I think I mentioned before this concept of losing talent, right? So even if we thought, well, you know, we can't meet the needs of every single student every day, there are always these outliers. You know, we can't get them all, we can't save them all, it's impossible, just like thought it was impossible. How do we design those seats to be flexible? How do we design an environment? How could we possibly design an environment that would truly meet the individual needs of every student? I would argue it is possible, and it should be possible, not just because we care about kids, but let's just think about it from a socioeconomic standpoint, or an economic standpoint rather. We're losing talent, right? We're losing it every single day if we continue doing business the way we do business in education most often. So I want you to stop and talk and turn and talk to someone near you, behind you, or in your school team, and I want you to think about what could you do today, what could you do in your school to create that adjustable cockpit? How can you design to the edges? What will you do to nurture individuality, individual potential in your school at large and maybe in your classroom, whatever your perspective is? Turn and talk, go. Till about 10:30.
10 minutes?
At least.
Okay, I'll turn you off right now and I'll turn you back.
No, don't turn it off. I'm sorry. I thought you meant me. No, they're only like 2 minutes.
Turn it off?
Yeah. All right, spend just a moment finishing your thoughts. And let's come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and let's come on back together as a group. Well, I don't know about you, but I didn't hear anybody was just stumped as to how to solve this problem, right? The ideas in this room alone were flowing and flowing. You were sharing. I heard lots and lots of great discussion. So we know the answers to how to do this are in this room. We know how to do it, and we can do it. And some of you are already doing it every day, and you have ideas that you can share with others. So I would encourage you to tweet out your ideas. How would you do this? So using that hashtag as you're thinking of ideas and they're coming to you. How do you make that happen in your school? How do you make that happen in your classroom? I would guess that one of the things you talked about was this idea of getting away from standardized practices, right? That really standard rote. Not if that was something that you all talked about in your group or something you mentioned. I see several. So I think that that's absolutely the case. We want to get away from this idea of standardization where the average is where we start operating from, meeting kids in the middle and then adjusting up and adjusting down, but recognizing that we need to meet each child where they are. But I want to talk about this notion for a second because there's some easily confused terms when we start talking about standardization and standards. And so oftentimes people think, okay, if we're trying to get away from this idea of standardization, we need to get rid of this notion of standards, right? It's just they don't work. But we're really talking about two different things here, right? So it's okay to have a set of standards off of which we operate, and we want our students to achieve those standards, right? But what we don't want to do in a standardized way is put them all on the same path towards reaching those standards, right? And we want to allow students multiple ways of attaining that mastery, of achieving the standards, and we want to have and offer multiple ways for students to demonstrate mastery of those. So the standardization we want to get away from is really about the processes that we put in place when we're looking at helping students achieve standards and high standards at that. So this idea of standards isn't necessarily a negative thing, but absolutely wanting to get away from the standardization and the processes there. Right? And I bet many of you talked about the idea of personalizing experiences for students, individualizing, and had some discussion around those concepts. And so again, there are these two terms that are often thrown around and sometimes confused. So if we think about this idea of individuality, absolutely, we want to honor that. But what about individualization itself? Oftentimes we can think of these worst case personalized learning scenarios or worst case individualized learning scenarios where a student takes a quiz online on a computer. It recognizes exactly where a student is as far as academic readiness, and they may spend the rest of their day or a lot of content area doing activities that are meant individually online to meet their individualized academic readiness. Now, while it's a good thing to meet students where they are academically, we don't want to sacrifice the individual for the sake of individualization. And that can happen when we isolate students in their learning, right? In order to foster our own individuality, we have to have social interaction at various points. And this is not just to create opportunities for students to thrive and communicate and develop those globally competitive skills. We think it allows them to develop their own individuality. Believe it or not, the social interactions you have with others help develop your own individuality. That can't happen without those interactions. So when we think about these scenarios where students are plugged in and spending time with individualization, in which case we think sometimes, yeah, we're really honoring that individual as a learner. We have to think about how we can honor individuality, but in doing so, setting up the right social interactions and the right balance of those and the right combination of that in the classroom so that we don't fall into that trap of personalizing or individualizing in a way that misses that for students. It's also important for teachers to get to know students through watching their social interactions, and we know from our transformational learning definition and graphic that this relationship between those dispositions we want students to have in the classroom around goal setting and reflecting and taking ownership of their learning and sort of being in the driver's seat really relate to these actions that teachers do around planning, teaching, and assessing and being responsive to that and really being co-pilots almost in the classroom, if you will. So if we think about the transformational learning, the definition, how we've defined it in Virginia Beach City Public Schools, I want you to just reflect on, marinate on that definition for a moment in your mind, right? So transformational learning is the active acquisition of knowledge and skills using student-centered practices that foster student agency and provide students with the opportunity to create and apply new knowledge across contexts. Notice it doesn't say to master a set of standards, right? So that's an assumed. What are they going to do with that knowledge? How are they going to apply it in new ways? How are they going to create with it? How are we creating opportunities for that while fostering student agency? So personalized learning supported through the purposeful use of technology is a primary mechanism for achieving transformational learning. So I want you to marinate on that definition for a bit, and I think you have a hard copy of it when you came in. Yes, good. And I also want you to look at the school division's definition of personalized learning as it was developed, and you have that on your handout as well. So if we think about the compelling reasons, the what, the why, and the how of personalized learning, I want you to look at both of those documents, and I want you to think for a moment about how do transformational learning and personalized learning make room for individuality? If that's the position we take around transformational learning as a school division, if that's our aim, and if that's our aim for personalized learning, as you see it within that infographic, how do those concepts make room for individuality? Go ahead and turn and talk once you've had a chance to process those definitions.
you went into your time. Just
I'm
whenever
trying to
you-
go
No,
fast.
whenever you're done, give them a 15-minute break. Just look at your watch and say,
Okay.
the next session will start at this time, and then the 12 o'clock session will start at this time, and that'll be all we said.
Okay.
We'll just, everybody can try to shorten it.
All right. Well, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to. Okay.
Yeah, just let them know.
Okay. Thanks. All right, let's come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and let's share our final thoughts and come back together as a group. You have a lot to share. You're feverishly excited. All right, let's come back together. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you. So hopefully, even if you've seen this transformational learning graphic before and you've read the definition and you've seen that infographic around personalized learning, you had just a minute to really marinate on that concept again, particularly now as we're thinking about the student, not just as a student, but as an individual, right? So what are we doing to make room for individuality? So we absolutely understand the broader concept of transformational learning and where we want to take our students, and we know that in order to get to transformational learning, we have to personalize experiences for students. And in doing that, in making personalized learning happen, we must foster student agency. But what we cannot lose sight of as we foster that student agency is that we must make room for the individual. And we need to figure out how to make that happen in our classrooms every day. And that's not easy to do oftentimes. In fact, when we look at even that concept of transformational learning, that's the kind of change that isn't just about adding a couple new practices into your toolbox, right? It's about embracing a new mindset. And I think that's for almost all of us as educators. I mean, I made that case earlier about the way society thinks as a whole, right? This is not just about an easy, well, if I just grab these new strategies and pull them into the classroom, I can achieve those things that we've outlined for Virginia Beach City Public Schools around transformational learning and around personalized learning. That's not possible. It doesn't happen that way. It's about shifting our mindsets and embracing change in order to transform those experiences and being able to sometimes let go of some stuff too. Sometimes when we try to do everything we were always doing before and embrace a new mindset, if we don't kind of let go of some of the other, that can be a really crowded space. So I think there's some necessary reflection when you're embarking upon change that's deep like this. So you've seen hopefully throughout the conference, and you're aware that in support of Compass 2020, our division strategic plan, each year we sort of publish a strategic action agenda centrally for schools to help schools focus on those strategic essential actions that will help us move forward as a division with attaining our Compass to 2020 goals. And one of those goals that was specifically outlined for this school year is around this notion that every single school this year should focus on fostering student agency by focusing on various elements of that student disposition within the transformational learning graphic. So while transformational learning depends not just on students, we know there's a teacher component, we know there's a learning environment component, right? We know there's a leadership component. All of these are integral, and a community component. All of those are important, none can be ignored, but this year we want you to really reflect, really hone and deepen your practice and understanding around the concepts related to the student, and particularly student agency, as we work on transformational learning in our schools. So again, as I said, while that focus is on the student and student agency, I don't want you to forget how, and as I mentioned, it's inextricably linked to all 5 of those other areas, but most particularly for the teacher. So as you're honing your practice this year around student agency, I want you to remember that when we're working towards fostering student agency, there are implications on teacher practice, right? Around planning, teaching, assessing in the classroom, about how we build relationships in the learning environment. So while we're going to be mainly focused on that student rubric and the student disposition in professional learning this year, let's also pay close attention to what those implications are for the teacher. They really are inextricably linked. So as you're thinking about how to create change in your classroom and allow for transformation, you know, a lot of us have heard this saying before, right? Almost everything works somewhere, but almost nothing works everywhere. And a lot of us are holding on to practices in our classroom that worked somewhere, and they worked at some time, and they're sort of still there. And that's okay, that's normal. We all do that. And I think what we need to do when we're embarking upon a great change like this, and we're really thinking about transforming, is what are those practices that may still belong and what may not? What do I need to make room for as I shift, or if I adopt this new mindset around the individual and I'm honing in on that, some other practices may fall away, like whole group assigned homework, or you name it. There are any number of practices, teaching content within content strands and time allotment. So as we rethink those things, we know that there might be some strategies we can eventually let go of. But how do you latch on to the strategies and practices that you know will work everywhere? Well, there are some things that we know work everywhere, and when you look specifically in that student rubric, you'll see that those dispositions we're aiming for with students are grounded in not only best practice around fostering student agency, but also in the research. So we know Hattie's work well, and I know you've heard this research many times over and over again, but I think we need to stop and pause and think about if you know, we want to really go for the low-hanging fruit. We want to make an impact. We can't afford to lose time when we're working with our students, and we know we have to meet the individual and make room for that individual. What are those practices we should hold on to? Well, if the desired effect size for change is 0.4, we want things that are in that high zone of desired effects, right? So look at this one. This one's a 0.72. That's pretty high. And this is this concept of, or this notion around teacher-student relationships. And Hattie's not just defining this as positive rapport between the teacher and student, like we're happy, you're happy, everybody's happy, we've got a great teacher-student relationship. That's not what Hattie's talking about. Hattie's talking about this integral, careful, purposeful relationship between the teacher and the student, where there's strong understandings about expectations in the classroom. There's a climate of trust in which, if students are going to be goal setting and risk taking, they feel safe doing so, that there's a relationship between the teacher and the student so that students know that teachers are the trusted adult they can go to when they're grappling with a concept, when they're stretching their thinking, right? Students operate in this interesting space between struggle, hopefully, productive struggle and challenge, and success. And in living in that space of struggle and challenge can feel unsafe to students. So without that strong teacher-student relationship, learning doesn't happen. So this works everywhere. This works all the time. This is research-based and should be given careful attention in every classroom every day. And this notion of teacher clarity, that one's pretty high too. And that doesn't just mean that the teacher is the all-knowing being in the classroom, right? The teacher is crystal clear, so everybody else ought to be too, right? So we know the importance of, yes, the teacher has to know and have clarity, and then there has to be that connection, that relationship between the teacher and student actions in the classroom. And Hattie really defines teacher clarity here as teachers knowing the standards, right? Knowing the students, knowing each and every student. That's part of this clarity part, right? Knowing the standards, knowing the students, finding gaps, and being able to eliminate gaps by having clarity on individual students, right? So that teacher clarity is crucial. Works everywhere, works in every classroom, is research-based, and deserves careful reflection and attention. Relationships, clarity, and then this notion, look how high this one is. This is like almost as high as you can get with desired effects. So you talk about something that we know works all the time everywhere. And it's listed here as self-reported grades and student expectations. But again, this isn't where Hattie's saying, yep, students are like, you know what, I think I got an A on that. I'm reporting my own grade. And it's not even so much about grades and scores. It's about students understanding that assessment is for them. That assessment is the picture of how the student is doing in the classroom, and that it's the roadmap to mastery, right? That students have a direct connection between assessment and the work they're doing in the classroom, and they see that assessment, again, is for them. It's feedback meant for them. And that feedback cycle, that feedback loop, is really meant to help them attain their goals. And so that's where that self-reported grades and students understanding where they fall along a continuum of learning are really crucial. And also, again, that expectation that it's not simply about a teacher-assigned score, and that's what really Hattie's talking about, the self-reported. It's self-owning. It's not what the teacher assigns me. It's that my work is a reflection of where I am today. And any assessment that's given like that formally or informally is meant to provide feedback that helps me on that journey. That assessment and feedback are for me and they're about me as the student. So here's a snapshot right from our student disposition rubric, right? And it's only one aspect of the many that are there in the rubric. But when we look at that exemplary category, and we look particularly at the dispositions we're aiming for students so that we can enable transformation in our classrooms, note this piece. Students throughout the school regularly self-assess their learning and reflect on this to develop and guide their personal learning pathway. Voice, choice, and student agency are present. This next piece, critical. In the best case scenario, the student works with the teacher to decide how to acquire information. The student decides the best way to demonstrate knowledge and mastery. Notice that while we're in the student rubric, we're not just talking about students here, are we? There are essential actions for the teacher, right? In that best case scenario, that student-teacher relationship has to be present to enable this to happen, right? There has to be teacher clarity, and the student has to understand the purpose of assessment and how it is feedback and information for them, and that they alone own that. So in order to really take this information and deepen our practice, as I said, for that strategic action item that was outlined for all schools this year, to really hone our practice around the concept of student agency, the school division has set aside 2 professional learning days. You can clearly see when they are, October and August, and I know that August day is coming soon. And the focus is really to be on student agency and the student. But remember, there are those implications for the teacher as well. So I don't want us to lose so much sight of focusing on the student rubric that we forget to reflect on, and then what are the implications for practice on the part of the classroom teacher. So we're going to spend some time preparing in your team planning time today, sort of as a runway for that August 29th day, because you will blink and that will be here, and it's hard to believe summer is nearing an end. But you're going to take your learning from this conference, and you're going to take some learning and supports that we've provided for you, and you're going to have some time to work towards preparation for those 2 days. So let me tell you a little bit about how that's going to work. When you get to your team planning area, you'll have a folder for your school that has a lot of hard copy information that's also going to be found digitally as well, but that gives you a little bit of flexibility. So don't worry about scratching down. I see people wanting to feverishly write directions. It'll all be provided for you, so no stress. But you're going to spend time planning as a team for those days, and we have given you lots of resources, including plans you could use as is, you could tweak to meet the needs of your school, but you're really going to need to spend time reflecting on where your school fell on that student disposition rubric, right? When your administrator submitted a rating for your school, or if you have a new administrator, they're aware of the rating that was submitted prior to their arrival, and you're going to reflect. Does that still make sense? Does it make sense for all faculty and staff? Are there changes we need to think about? And how will we approach learning together collectively as a faculty, and how will we honor individual teacher needs, just like we would honor individual student needs? And we've provided you a template for talking through what that plan will look like, so you can provide some opportunities for your staff both on August 29th and October 9th. And so, as I said, the link to the site that's got all the directions and the templates and helps you with what you need is going to be in a folder at your team planning location. But also, if all else fails, you don't find the folder, we all know how to get to the Teaching and Learning intranet page. And so there's a link right under the Transformational Learning Readiness Guide to your team planning guide. So if you click on that, everything you need is there. There's a short video. It's actually a narrated PowerPoint that will walk you through how to best make use of your team planning time and point you to all of the documents that you may need, that you may want to explore, as well as the planning template. So you'll have everything you need there. So I think it's only fitting when we talk about student agency that we don't always look at things from the adult perspective, and we really honor student voice. And so I want to show you this short video clip of students and their message for teachers.
Dear teacher, I know it doesn't always seem like it, but I really do want to listen to It's my brain. It's kind of. So this is what I'd like you to know about me. I have to move, or I really can't pay attention.
No, I'm not looking at you. I can still listen to what you're saying.
If you tell me, sit up straight, now I have to use all of my brain to do just that.
It makes me feel sad when you tell me to try harder, even though I've already tried as hard as I can. I actually listen better when I'm rocking in my chair. When you give me a bunch of directions, I start to think, I will never remember all this. Sometimes my mom and dad ends up doing all of my homework. Sometimes maybe no. Let me get up and move while I'm moving.
Let me look wherever I want when you talk to me.
Let me rock or slouch in my chair.
No matter what, please don't take away my recess. I could do it all by myself. Instructions very short.
Just ask me, what does your brain need right now?
And one more thing. My brain might be different than yours, but it's still amazing. Sincerely, your student.
You're a student.
Your student. Your student.
So we just heard from a group of students with some learning differences, and they expressed their needs to move. But I bet if you asked any student in any classroom, at any level, in any Virginia Beach City public school, he or she would tell you, I didn't come here to be average. I came here to be amazing. right? The little girl said it best. My brain may be different, but it's still amazing. And so we can no longer afford to compare students to the group, to operate on a system of average in education. You know, one powerful example from Todd Rose's book, you know, he talks about this time when he was a high school dropout and then also being a college professor, and he points out that having a system that compares the individuals to the group hurts students on both ends of the spectrum. We're not just talking about our lowest performing students. In any educational setting, even for the students who have made it to the top, we can no longer afford to do business this way. We need to honor the individual. We can do that by fostering student agency. You know how, you have the strategies, you were brainstorming them. You're going to go out, you're going to plan those professional learning days for your teachers. You're going to develop and strengthen that knowledge. You're going to try to let go of some of those mindsets that have trapped us not only as a society but in education, and you are absolutely going to go out and be amazing. Enjoy the rest of your conference and best of luck at your team planning.